Have you ever looked at history and wondered how a massive, glittering empire, one that basically defined Central Europe for centuries, could just poof? Vanish? Seriously, the Austro-Hungarian Empire didn't just fall, it completely shattered. So today, let's get into how this incredible house of cards came tumbling down. This quote right here, it really gets to the heart of what made the empire so weird, so unique. See, this wasn't a country like France or Germany, united by one people. Nope, it was this huge collection of different lands, languages, and cultures, all held together by just one thing: loyalty to the Habsburg dynasty. And for a long, long time, that was actually its superpower. But that sets up the big, crucial question, right? What happens to an empire like that, an empire built on loyalty to a king, when this powerful new idea called nationalism just sweeps across the continent? An idea that says your loyalty isn't to some emperor, but to your people. I mean, from the outside, everything looked amazing. Vienna was the place to be, the center of the world for music, for art, for science. The empire looked huge, powerful, ancient. But underneath all that glitter, the foundations were already starting to crack.
And that's where the real villain of our story comes in: nationalism. This idea was going to act like a slow-acting poison in the veins of the whole Habsburg monarchy.
So what even is nationalism? Well, to put it simply, it's the idea that a group of people who share a culture and a history, a nation, should have their own state, and that your number one ultimate loyalty should be to that nation-state, not to some distant emperor you've never met.
And if you look at this comparison, you can see the huge problem right away. For a place like Germany, nationalism was awesome. It was a unifying force that brought German speakers together. But for Austria-Hungary, with its dozens of languages and cultures all mashed together, it was an existential threat. It basically told the Czechs, the Poles, the Serbs, and the Hungarians to see themselves as separate peoples, not as subjects of one big, happy empire.
Okay, so you're the emperor. Your empire is trying to tear itself apart from the inside. What do? How do you hold it all together? Well, you build a shield. And that shield was the imperial and royal army. Its main job, as this quote makes brutally clear, wasn't just to fight other countries. It was to fight the enemies within, all those nationalists who were threatening to break the empire into a million pieces. The whole idea, right, was to create this one institution that stood above all that national stuff. The thinking was, once you're in the army, you're not a Czech, you're not a Hungarian, you're not a German. You are a soldier, and your one and only loyalty is to the emperor. It was meant to be just super glue holding this whole fragile thing together. Yeah, great plan. Except there was a massive, fatal flaw. When you actually looked under the hood of this supposedly unifying army, you didn't find unity at all. You found a Tower of Babel, just, armed with bayonets. Okay, so get this. To even make the army function, they had this insanely complicated language system. First, you had about 80 basic commands, like halt and fire, that were in German for everybody. That was the Kommandosprache. Then, all the official paperwork and talk between officers, the Dienstsprache, was also in German. But the day-to-day language the soldiers actually spoke to each other, the Regimentssprache, was whatever their native tongue was. So who were these guys, the actual soldiers on the ground? Well, ethnic Germans were only about a quarter of them. The army was a total melting pot of everyone in the empire. Which leads to the really crucial question: who was in charge? And boom, here's the problem. While the grunts were from all over, the professional officer corps was overwhelmingly German. We're talking a staggering 78%. You see the massive disconnect here? So you've got this huge gap, right? A cultural gap, a language gap, and it just bred this deep, deep resentment. Soldiers from other groups felt like their cultures were disrespected, and that all the good jobs are just for the Austrians. It's like what one Czech soldier wrote: "My race damns me in the eyes of my superiors." This wasn't a unified shield. It was an institution that was just riddled with distrust. So at the same time the army is basically rotting from the inside out, the dynasty itself is about to get hit by a scandal, a really personal, really public tragedy that's going to shake the entire empire. It all goes down on January 30th, 1889.
Crown Prince Rudolf, the emperor's only son, the heir to the throne, is found dead next to his teenage lover, Mary, etc. The palace immediately tries to cover it up, claiming he died of a heart attack. But the truth, that it was a murder-suicide, gets out, and it sends absolute shockwaves across Europe.
And yeah, they found farewell notes. One from Mary Vitsera had this absolutely haunting line. The notes just confirmed the tragic, awful reality. The heir to the throne had been in such despair that he'd planned this. Okay, so a royal scandal, a personal tragedy, but why should we care? Why did this one event in a remote hunting lodge have such massive consequences for an entire continent? Well, it mattered because Rudolf wasn't just any royal. He was the only son, the one and only direct heir. His death threw the entire line of succession into chaos. And the new heir? His cousin, a guy named Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So not only did Meierling show the world the sickness at the heart of the dynasty, it literally put the man whose assassination would kick off World War I next in line for the throne. So let's pull all the threads together now. You've got a society being ripped apart by nationalism. You've got an army that's crippled by its own divisions. And you have a dynasty that's been destabilized by tragedy. The house of cards was standing, but it was wobbling, ready to fall at the slightest touch. And here's the most important thing to get from all of this. World War I did not cause the collapse of Austria-Hungary. It was just the final push. The empire was an already rotten building, and the war was just the storm that finally knocked it over. And if you want a number, a single number to show you just how rotten it was, here it is. By the end of the war, 125,000 soldiers from the Imperial and Royal Army had defected. They literally went over to the other side to fight against the very empire they sworn oaths to protect. The emperor's shield hadn't just cracked, it had completely shattered and turned on itself. Which really leaves us with this one big question, doesn't it? The Habsburgs had this dream of an empire that existed above all the petty squabbles of nationality. But they tried to build it in an age where the nation was becoming the most powerful idea in the world. So, in a world that was being defined by nations, was this supranational empire ever going to be anything other than a beautiful, tragic failure? That's a question that still echoes today.